Welcome back to the channel. This is the Matt Borka Show. And as you guys know, on this channel, we talk a lot about success and family and money and business. And those are very important things. But what if the idea of being successful is crumbling in front of our very eyes? And it's something that a lot of people are talking about right now. There's a lot of concerns about the economy and what's been happening pretty much since COVID, really. There's been a lot of stress, and a lot of people in the States are talking about, what's been going on with the tariffs and how tariffs are affecting everyday people. And the subject of tariffs started to emphasize the importance of discussions around economics, and I feel the general public start to have a bigger demand, an increasingly bigger demand for really understanding how economics work overall, but also there's more and more channels and videos popping up on YouTube about the very topic of, what's been going on from everyday folks. So in this video, we're going to talk about something that is very close to my heart, something that I care about a lot, and that is wage stagnation. And I feel the reason why this is a very important topic is that in the past couple of decades, really, we have seen extremely stagnant wages. So I'm going to dedicate this entire video toward understanding why it is happening. And folks, it's very important for you to understand this. This is not an opinion piece. I've done my research. I've done my homework. And what I want to do is, this is going to be more like an analysis instead of just me trying to spit my opinions everywhere. And I don't really feel that works, because I feel in today's environment, it's actually more important to shift toward facts instead of talking about principles. And this is actually something that David Pakman talks about in his book, The Echo Machine. I feel it's a great idea. So again, in this video, we're going to talk about wage stagnation, why it's happening, what's causing it, and really for us to understand the entirety of the situation and what we need to do about it in order to fix it. So in order to have a really good understanding of wage stagnation, we got to hop into our imaginary time machine, and we need to have a look at the period after World War II. And that period, so from World War II up until the 1970s, the average worker really enjoyed prosperity. We have seen wage increases, and there was a general prosperity across the United States. However, as we're moving toward the early 1970s, we have seen a shift, and the wage increases started to slow down. Now, if we're having a look at some data here, so again, we're talking about the early 1970s. The music really started to fade around that time. So the average worker, and again, adjusted for inflation as well. So the average worker has only seen a 0.2% increase per year in terms of pay. That's insane. And that's, again, we adjusted for inflation. All right. It's ridiculous. And this has been going on for decades as well. So it's not like this has only been happening for, as I mentioned earlier in the video, for a couple of years. This has been going on since the early 1970s. So for us to really understand why that's happening, we got to dig deeper and really understand the true meaning behind this and why it's happening in the first place. So now that we established that wage stagnation started to really happen since the early 1970s, we also have to look at a couple of other metrics, a couple of other numbers based on my research. So over roughly the same 4 decades, right? So from the early 1970s until kind of nowadays, the top 1% saw their income shoot up by 158%. Okay. And what about the top 0.1%? they've seen a staggering increase in their income by 341%. And these are real numbers. Again, just like I normally do in my videos, I'm going to put some links in the description and feel free to check them out, because this is purely based on statistics and data, right? These are not my opinions. Like, this is from very extensive research. The crazy thing is, right, productivity actually shot up by 70% during the same period, yet the average person saw less than a 12% bump in their pay. And if you really think about it, this is the very thing that pisses Americans off, because they can feel it. You can feel it. That you're working your ass off, and there's always some, and maybe this is just my opinion here, that there's always a reason for not getting that pay rise. And there's always a good reason for it, right? Oh, we're not doing well, or oh, there's something else going on in the business and we cannot afford it. But in reality, there's other factors here that really allowed employers to do that, because it's not like, oh, well, we don't have the money. No, businesses do have money, right? But everything is so optimized for profits nowadays that clearly, and this data shows it, it's black and white. It's right there. The top 1% has seen a crazy increase in their pay or in their income. Yet the average person is struggling. The top 1% always finds ways to justify an increase in wages or an increase in profits for themselves. And for some reason, they tend to forget about everyday people. And this data clearly shows that. We established that there's major wage stagnation in the United States. So what? So how can we fix this? Why is this all happening? Okay, so in order for us to really understand wage stagnation, we got to talk about something called aggregate demand. All right. So let me explain what that means. Lower to middle income households tend to spend their cash. Okay? That's an economically proven fact. While higher income households tend to hold on to their money. Ultimately, what this causes, when lower and middle income households don't have as much disposable cash, the economy starts to slow down, because these people are not spending their money. And when they're not spending their money, overall, the businesses are not doing well, because their customers, the consumers, are the lower to middle income households. Recessions happen, it's not like the money disappears, right? The money doesn't disappear during a recession, but there are fewer transactions because people are holding on to their money, because a recession is partly, absolutely, there are factors that are causing the recession, but overall, the economic behavior is fewer transactions. It's really, really important for us to understand. So this aggregate demand thing, what it says is that when everything overall slows down, it's bad for the economy. So it's absolutely necessary to put money into the pockets of lower and middle income households, because they are the very engines of the economy. And when they don't have disposable income, everyone is doing worse. So it's extremely important to understand that wage stagnation is just so bad for the economy, because at the end of the day, if you don't have money to spend as a lower to middle income household, obviously it's bad for them, but it's actually bad for everyone overall. And besides aggregate demand, we also have to talk about the American dream itself, right? Because upward mobility is a real issue nowadays. And we also have some data on this. So, and it's actually pretty sobering, because historically speaking, the chances of out-earning your parents were pretty good, okay? So someone born into a middle-class family in 1940 had a 93% chance of earning more than their parents by the age of 30. Okay? 93%. That's pretty good. But what about someone born in 1980? Well, the chance plummeted down to 45%. That is less than half. Unfortunately, I don't have data here for people born a little later, so like millennials and such. But what we're looking at is what this data says: the American dream is fading away. It's becoming harder and harder for everyday Americans to move up the ladder. And this causes a lot of emotional upheaval for everyday people, because they can see it. They know, they talk to their parents, and they have evidence of them doing better than their parents, the grandparents, right? But that's not happening anymore. People are struggling. People are having difficulties. People are having less and less money, and they don't understand why. And politicians are saying that, yes, this is a huge problem. Tax the rich, tax them. Okay, tax them, but why? Why do we have to tax them? Why is it happening? Show us the data. And again, I like Bernie Sanders. I like AOC, right? I think what they're doing is really good. However, what they don't talk about is what we need to do in order to fix the problem. Because by saying tax the rich 20 times, we're not talking about why we need to do it, what's causing all these issues, and what we're going to do with the money. Because at the end of the day, when you say tax the rich, that money is going to go to the government. And we have plenty of evidence of the government not budgeting our money correctly, right? That's why Doge is a thing. And a lot of people are pissed off about government waste. And yes, sure, we could say that Doge is not working as effectively, whatever. However, this is a problem. And we have to understand why it's happening, what we need to do to fix it. Actually, not talking about these very numbers, we're actually doing a disservice to the American people. Okay, so now we talked about aggregate demand. We talked about how the American dream is fading, but we haven't really talked about the causes, right? The actual causes themselves. We're talking about the symptoms, but not the causes. Okay. First of all, I have to say something super quick. We cannot blame everything on some evil villain, whether you think Trump is a villain or someone else, right? It's not like we have some mini me or something in some volcano lair stroking a white cat and telling the government, well, we got to screw with people. That's not how it works. There are bigger factors here at play, and we're going to have a look at what those factors are. And we're going to talk about, again, some numbers around them. And yeah, I think it's really cool because I haven't really seen many videos about this, and I do consume a lot of YouTube videos. So let's dive in. Let's have a look at what's going on. Let's go. Okay. So the first thing we need to talk about when it comes to the causes of wage stagnation is interest rates, the Federal Reserve, inflation, and high unemployment. Because these factors had contributed severely to wage stagnation itself in the United States. Okay, so since the early 1970s, the Federal Reserve has been on top of controlling and fine-tuning interest rates in order to make sure that inflation stays low. And we all know this because it's on the news all the time, right? How the Federal Reserve lowered interest rate, increased interest rate. And it's one of the things they can do in order to ensure we're not going into a recession or we're not experiencing stagflation, right? So that's all good, right? Because we don't want inflation to to go crazy because that's not good for the economy. However, this extreme focus on controlling inflation led to higher unemployment. And when we have higher unemployment, it doesn't really matter whether we have data on it or not, because there's a lot of talks about unemployment being in a good place. Yet, what we're looking at is when unemployment is higher, again, whether it doesn't really matter what data is being reported, when unemployment is higher, wages stay stagnant because workers are losing bargaining power, because there's more people out there looking for work. Therefore, workers don't have the bargaining power necessary to say, hey, listen, actually, this is the pay I want. Because employers could say, well, that's all fine and dandy. We can just choose a different person who's not that adamant about getting that extra $500 per month or $1,000 per month or whatever the case is. So that's that interplay. And it's actually a pretty negative unintended consequence, because I feel what the Federal Reserve is doing in terms of trying their best to lower interest rates and make sure that inflation is in place, that's not a bad thing overall, because we know exactly what happens when inflation is skyrocketing. And we've seen that during COVID, that the Federal Reserve did have to do, they did have to adjust interest rates in order to make sure that inflation doesn't go even higher, right? That's all good, but that led to higher unemployment, whether the data is being reported or not. And we are losing our bargaining power because of that. My second point is the disappearance of unions. Because back in the day, when there were more unions and also factories were unionized, unions were actually fighting for the rights of average workers. They made sure that we're getting better health insurance and we're getting paid a fair wage, right? But there are laws out there, and it's actually difficult nowadays, and more difficult to unionize. And because of that, we're looking at a situation where we are losing our bargaining power because we don't have these unions to support us and to help us ensure we're getting paid a fair wage, because it's always going to be a push and pull, right? We're talking about capitalism after all. A business will always want to maximize profits. And then on the other side, on the other hand, workers will want to obviously maximize their wages because that's more money for them. So after all, we're talking about two different parties with different interests, really. And unions really helped to negotiate, to ensure that workers are getting paid a fair wage. And the way they're disappearing, it's really not helping the average worker. Not only that, but we're talking about factories overall, right? Because in the mid 20th century, that's where you really had unions. But nowadays, if you think about tech companies or if you think about the service sector, you don't really have unions. So people in those industries they don't really have the power to fight for better wages because there's no one fighting for them. When it comes to the disappearance of unions, there's also something else we have to talk about. So the Economic Policy Institute estimates that the decline in wage growth and also the decline in unions can explain about a third of the growth in wage inequality among men since the 1970s. A third. That's insane. That's huge. Now, the problem with unions is that they're unpopular, right? Business owners don't really want their employees to unionize because when they do, it means their profits are going to go down. So again, it's a push and pull type of situation. And unfortunately, when we have fewer unions, we don't really have that bargaining power on the workers' side. And again, as the data says, this has contributed to a third of the growth in wage inequality, especially among men, right? So that's insane. Those are crazy numbers. And again, unless we do something about this, this is not going to change. And I'm not saying that, well, now we have to unionize everything, although a bit of unionization could help. And I'd argue that it would need to be introduced in many other sectors in order to make sure that workers are being protected, because right now that protection doesn't exist. We know that industries are changing and unions are not really a thing anymore, right? They're not as popular, but analysts say that weakening labor laws also contribute to the lack of unions. And unfortunately, again, what that means is workers they cannot bargain effectively, and also they cannot organize because their laws are really not there to support unionization. The next factor we need to talk about is, unfortunately, loopholes and also wage theft. If you don't know what wage theft is, it's basically the idea of employers not paying for certain things. So like just straight up, just not paying workers or not paying for overtime, right? And that's actually pretty sad, because we're actually looking at billions of dollars being stolen from workers like that. And there's a couple of things here, right? So one of them is agencies don't have the budget and also the power to enforce these laws, and that contributes to wage theft. But not only that, there's also a lack of transparency, or workers are not really aware of what their rights are. So when they don't know, well, I'm actually entitled to overtime, or they don't know that, oh, by the way, I should have been paid for that. So a lot of times what happens is employers know more about the law, and the workers they don't have the information necessary to really understand what's happening. And ultimately what that causes is that we're talking about billions of dollars not being paid out to these workers. And that's also a huge issue. So another thing we have to talk about here, for example, there's no federal requirement for employers to even provide a pay stub. Okay. So they don't know how it's calculated. And when there's no slip and people don't know how much they need to get paid, there's an increasing chance of employers tricking their workers into just not paying them what is due, right? Also, we have to talk about how protection for overtime has eroded a lot as well. The average salaried worker, they don't even understand whether they can argue for the overtime pay. So more often than not, they're going to put more hours in and they're not getting paid for it. And it's also a huge issue. I've seen that many, many times. I have anecdotal evidence of this, that this is something that businesses use to really sometimes trick their workers into working more for the same amount of money. And people are not really aware of the laws around overtime pay. And something else we need to talk about, and unfortunately, I have some experience in this. Some businesses have this tendency to misclassify employees as independent contractors. And the reason why this is a huge issue is that if you are a 1099 contractor in the United States, whether you're a domestic contractor or an international contractor, because if you are working outside of the United States, you can become a 1099 contractor. And in reality, that's the only way for American businesses to employ staff overseas, right? The issue there is that sometimes these contractors are being treated as employees when in reality, that's illegal. When you are an independent contractor, you don't get benefits and you don't have the same rights as an employee, and you're not being protected the same way. And I have unfortunately seen this where some businesses hollow out their entire operation because they don't want to pay benefits and they're trying to save money. But then all the workers, all the employees are still being treated as employees, but in reality, they're all 1099 contractors. And it's a huge issue because it's one of the ways businesses are taking rights away from their employees or people who are working for those businesses. But not only that, what happens when you're an independent contractor, again, you don't have the same bargaining power as a W-2 employee because the rules don't apply to you, right? And again, that's also a massive issue because your rights are being taken away. You're not entitled to health insurance. You're not entitled to benefits, yet you're still being treated as an employee. So again, this is a huge problem. I feel there aren't many people talking about it because workers are not aware that these things are happening. And unfortunately, businesses hugely benefit from using this tactic to save money. The next thing we have to talk about is technology and automation. We all heard about AI taking away all of our jobs and how it's going to have a detrimental impact on employment. But we have to talk about this because there's actually a theory behind this. And the theory is called skill bias technological change. Okay, so SBTC for short. And what this suggests is that things like the computer revolution increased the demand for workers with higher education and cognitive skills. So think about engineers, think about analysts and managers. At the same time, it reduced the demand for workers doing routine tasks, right, that are easier to automate. And think about, assembly line work and clerical jobs. And those are the things that are apparently being taken away according to this theory. And another theory or concept we have to talk about when it comes to this is job polarization. Okay. And what this means is tech is hollowing out the very middle of the job market. What do I mean by that? So what it does is it creates this environment where high skills are more in demand. So there's more demand for abstract jobs, right, at the very top. And also at the same time, more low skill work. Okay. So like manual service jobs at the bottom, like, I don't know, personal care or food service, which are more harder to automate. So on one hand, this theory says, you know what, we need more people doing like abstract work, right? People who can handle the tech, who can manage the tech, right? So think about the service sector, consulting, that sort of thing. But also at the same time, there are things that cannot be automated, and that there's an increasing demand for those types of work as well. But then you have this segment in the middle, right? And that's the very thing that's disappearing. Think about the older manufacturing jobs, right? So why is this a big issue? Because back in the day, that middle, right? And we're, talking about, again, going back to Rust Belt, that sort of thing. Those middle skill jobs were paying very, very well. Like it offered a decent pay. And those jobs are the ones that are disappearing, right? So people who are, I don't know, good at computers, IT, that sort of thing, they have a path. There's a lot of things to choose. For example, I've been doing media buying or digital marketing for the past 8 years, right? But then let's say you're more hands-on and you're good with your hands, right? And again, those jobs are kind of going away, right? That sweet middle part. Okay. The next point we have to talk about is deindustrialization. Okay. So what happened was, as factory work in general, as it was disappearing in the United States, they were actually pretty good and well-paying jobs. And as these jobs, as they start to move overseas, right, the unintended consequence of that is that those were actually really good jobs, and they started to disappear, and they started to become more commoditized, and they are no longer available in the United States because some of it ended up in China or other parts of the world. Now, the other thing that happened here is that there was a shift toward service sector jobs, and sometimes those jobs aren't paying as well, right? So on one hand, you have these manufacturing jobs that used to be in the United States, and that's kind of like Trump's thing, right? Like, let's bring those back because those were well-paying jobs. Unfortunately, times have changed, and the nature of those jobs and the very essence of what created them are not there anymore, because factories and companies who are doing manufacturing, they're trying to bring the cost down. And by having those jobs in the United States, everything would be more expensive. So it doesn't really make sense to pay US wages for those types of jobs when they can be executed at a much lower rate elsewhere, for example, in China. And the issue here is that if you don't have a college degree, what are your options? You could start a business around trades, right? Like roofing or fencing or HVAC or something like that, right? You could do that, or you could work for one of those businesses. Or if you have a college degree, you're more than likely you're going to end up working in the service sector in one shape or form. Or in essence, what we have here is those jobs went away and they don't really exist anymore. Instead, you have these different routes and they're not paying as well, right? And also you have less bargaining power. So deindustrialization played a major role in this. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem like tariffs are going to fix it, right? Those jobs are not going to reappear because the nature of those jobs has changed. So unfortunately, that's not an option anymore. So yeah, that's basically deindustrialization for you. And yeah, it hasn't had a good impact on wage stagnation or wage inequality at all. Another factor we have to talk about here is executive wages. Because what happened was, over the course of the decades we're mentioning in this video, unfortunately, executive wages have significantly outpaced the average worker pay, but also economic productivity. And some people say that what happens is boards are not really being strict about these pays, and unfortunately, it's also in their best interest to have those rewards there, right? And unfortunately, when you see those crazy numbers, and unfortunately I don't have those in front of me, how much CEOs and executives are getting paid, that comes at the cost of the average worker's wage, because when they're talking about profit margins and whatnot, right? Unfortunately, when these people are getting so much more than the average worker, in reality, I'm not saying that they don't need that money, but just imagine if we were to take away a few $1,000s, okay? And that few $1,000s per executive or whatever that is, if we were to add that to the average worker's wage, everyone would be better off. And it wouldn't be a huge amount, because these people are getting so much money and it's ridiculous. Here's my point though. I feel the issue when it comes to this specifically is these executives got used to a certain lifestyle and they need that much money in order to maintain that lifestyle, because with the emergence of social media, it's becoming more and more important to ensure that people are aware that you have that type of lifestyle and it's being documented on camera, right? And when you're under societal pressure to show that you've been doing well, you're going to use that money in order to show to the world that, hey, look, I'm a fancy executive. I can go on these trips. I have this car. I have this house. And unfortunately, what happens is that these CEOs and executives kind of forget, hey, by the way, I wouldn't be able to be here if my team wasn't putting the work in, because just the executive team alone wouldn't be enough to keep the company going. So unfortunately, there's a major disconnect there. And it looks like, based on my research, the board members are in on it. And unfortunately, yes, sure, we could talk about the tax rates as well when it comes to executives and how it's absolutely in their favor, right? But I feel this is more on, when we're looking at the issue overall, I feel the bigger problem here is that board members are completely in on this, and they're not holding executives accountable, and that also results in wage stagnation. And now we have to talk about the tax cut debate, because it's been a major talking point among politicians like Bernie Sanders that we have to tax the rich and we need to make sure that companies are paying their fair share. And there's different iterations of this, right? Because some people talk about introducing some wealth tax, other people talk about increasing the corporate tax rate. But yeah, let's kind of look at what the arguments are on both sides, because in order for us to really understand this, we have to talk about both sides here. So one side is saying that with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, with the lower corporate tax, those lower taxes were supposed to incentivize businesses to invest, and those investments should trickle down, and they should help the workers out by, they're having more to do and they can get more, they can get promoted, there's more money for that. But unfortunately, some analysts are saying that after 2017, that's not what happened. They're saying a large chunk of that money, the corporate tax burden, fell onto the workers, the average workers, and they actually didn't benefit from the benefits of the lower tax rates. And also at the same time, some economists are saying that unfortunately the primary beneficiaries of these tax cuts were shareholders, and this caused a surge in corporate profits and also stock buybacks. And that's kind of like what we're looking at here, right? Because actually, someone in one of my previous videos, we were talking about this, how I feel that by keeping corporate tax low, it actually benefits small businesses as well, right? And we were not specifically talking about trickle-down economics. We were talking about how, as a small business, you can actually opt in for a different way to pay tax, which would be being a corporation instead of being an LLC, right? And a lot of people forget that just because you have a corporation, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're Apple, right? It could mean that you opted in for a different type of taxation, right? The point here is, unfortunately, it's a double-edged sword, really, because by increasing corporate tax, that also has an impact on small businesses, not only the big corporations. So in order for us to really fix this, we have to have a look at the corporate tax structure overall. And unfortunately, one of the big benefits of having a corporation is that it's a flat tax for everyone, right? So in reality, if you're paying your tax correctly, you are going to pay more, because a bigger corporation like Apple, they have more income. So that income is obviously, it's going to be more compared to a small business. However, the argument is, by lowering the corporate tax rate, the average worker did not benefit from those tax cuts. Unfortunately, based on some of the data and what economists are saying, that money went up to the top 1% instead of going down to the bottom 99. And I feel in order to fix this, we would need to really look at the tax code overall and look at ways to. The idea here is we want to incentivize entrepreneurs to reinvest the money. That be the whole point. But if they're gonna take the money out, right? If they're gonna take out so-called distributions when they're taking out the profits instead of paying themselves a salary, then obviously that's not a good thing. So maybe in order to fix this, we have to look at different things and we have to solve this a little differently. And maybe the tax cuts are not the best way to do it. And last but not least, we have to talk about the gig economy, because there's been a rise in gig workers over the past couple of years, and not only gig workers, but also independent contractors. Now, the issue is, even though independent contractors have more flexibility, more independence, but at the same time, they have less rights compared to a W-2 employee. So what ended up happening, and again, just by doing business and interacting with independent contractors, and I've been an independent contractor as well over the course of my career, unfortunately, this status does come with fewer rights. And unfortunately, some businesses have the tendency to take advantage of independent contractors by paying them less, by treating them as employees, but in reality, they're not employees. And there's a bunch of laws around this. When you're working with an independent contractor, you cannot hold that independent contractor to any deadlines. You can't do that. They have the power to dictate what they do and how much they're doing for the amount of money they're asking. And that's the key point, because an independent contractor says, hey, this is what I'm charging. That's where the conversation flips. Whereas with an employee, they say, well, how much are you willing to give me? However, what happens when someone becomes an independent contractor, they don't understand sometimes the dynamics of that role and status. Because in reality, they should have the bargaining power, because they're working for themselves. They're not in the corporate hierarchy, or, I mean, yeah, sure, they can be treated as part of the team, whatever. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that they should have more bargaining power because they're working for themselves. If you're an independent contractor in the United States, like let's say how do you pay your tax? Well, you could be a so-called sole proprietor and you can have your LLC and you're the only member of that LLC, and that's how you pay tax. Well, technically then you're a business, not a small business, not an employee. So the rules are completely different. So unfortunately, companies have taken advantage of people trying to take advantage of the gig economy, and it's not good. And unfortunately, I feel the best way to solve this is to ensure that people are aware of their rights as independent contractors and what they can and can't do. Okay, now, I know that this was probably quite a lot of information to take in, but I wanted to make sure that I talk about every single thing in this video, because unfortunately, when you're looking at other YouTube videos and podcasts, they're not really talking about these things, not to my understanding, and I do consume a lot of this content, not like this. They don't talk about the actual points. They just talk about Trump and how Trump is bad and, oh, Trump is ruining the economy. Okay, cool. Fine. Yes, we all know that Trump is ruining the economy. Everyone can see that and you can feel it as well. But we have to be more factual. We have to look at overall economic trends, and it's our job as a society to ensure that everything is being fixed and taken care of, because it looks like politicians nowadays don't care about fixing these problems. They're more interested in insider trading. They're more interested in making sure that they can stay in power. And even the ones who are trying to do good, again, I feel a lot of what they're saying, it's rah-rah instead of saying, this is how we fix it, right? Because you cannot fix anything by saying, well, this is shit, this is bad, and let's blame the top 1% or let's blame Trump. We're not going to fix anything by saying the word Trump. It's good for views, but it's not good for fixing the economy. So let's have a look at some of the changes and potential strategies we have to introduce in order to make sure that we're being on top of fixing wage stagnation in the United States of America. First and foremost, we have to reorient macroeconomic policy. Why? Because we need to make sure that full employment is a top priority. We cannot ignore the fact that many times the Federal Reserve had more important things on their agenda, and that actually caused higher unemployment, as we talked about it before, and that had a major impact on the wages of everyday people. So in reality, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate here. We need stable prices and maximum employment. We could argue, and many people argue, that maximum employment needs more consistent emphasis, because overall what we're looking at is when we have sustained low unemployment, that historically speaking led to a friendlier environment in terms of wage growth. So low unemployment, that's more important to fix. That's what we need to focus on in order to get to a point where we have less wage stagnation. Second, strengthening worker voice and bargaining power. So why is that important? Because unfortunately, at this very minute, we don't really have the labor laws in place to support that. So we would really need a comprehensive labor law reform. We need to find ways to unionize more, and we need to get rid of all the laws that are preventing companies, not only factories and manufacturing jobs, from unionizing. Because with unionization, workers have the power and they have the bargaining power necessary in order to make sure that they see an increase in wages. Because a lot of times, the workers themselves don't have enough bargaining power in order to make that happen. So we need institutions to support those workers in order to make sure that they do have the bargaining power necessary to see an increase in their wages. And in order to do that, we do need some comprehensive changes to labor law to enable that. On top of this, we also need to make sure that federal minimum wage rises. Because, I mean, if you're looking at countries like the UK, that was one of the ways they solved some of the issues around economic distress in their country. But in order to make sure that this is fixed in the United States, we also have to consider other things, because in the UK, even though minimum wage has increased, middle income households were still left behind. On top of the raise in the federal minimum wage, we also have to enact and enforce stricter labor laws and laws around hourly wage to ensure that employers don't have the power to take the rightful wages away from the average worker. But not only that, we also need to make sure that the misclassification of workers don't happen. If you want to work with independent contractors, you need to make sure that you respect their status as an independent contractor. Because when you don't do that, I mean, at this minute, to my understanding, there's no law protecting independent contractors, and misclassification happens at a massive scale. Third point, we need to ensure that there's more public investment in education at all levels, from pre-K to affordable college and also vocational training. If we don't have an educated society, we are really looking at an environment where wage stagnation keeps going, and it's literally pushing people into poverty. So yes, it's very important. And I'm not saying that these improvements should only happen and only governments should be responsible for this. I feel the private education sector has to improve as well. There's been some experiments regarding online schools, but I'm a massive advocate for actually having more of those institutions and having more education available online, because everyone has access to the internet in the United States. So in order to make education more accessible and available to everyone, I feel taking the online route is also a viable option, because it reduces friction. And when you reduce friction and you make education available to more people, that is basically making sure that we're all winning at the same time. And fourth, and really last point, we do have to have a look at tax policy. Something has to change there. And I'm not saying that increasing corporate tax is going to be the ultimate solution, but someone with the expertise, someone with the right qualifications needs to have a look at this and say, how can we fix this? Because I feel the ultimate goal here is not to tax the rich, but to incentivize them to pay their workers more. Because when think about it, you're trying to negotiate with someone, and if you're trying to antagonize the other side, rich people can go and move to a different country and find tax havens. What you want to encourage them to pay their workers more, because ultimately that will help the economy. And also at the same time, a lot of times what happens, business people don't trust the government, right? When you say, well, I'm going to tax you more, they're not going to think about, well, what you're trying to say or do is actually what you're trying to incentivize me to invest more. That's not what it feels like. But it feels like you're coming after my money and the government wants to take it. So I also feel that there's a miscommunication around how that money is going to be ultimately treated. So yes, it's very important to have conversations about that as well, because the current tax policy is heavily in favor of the rich, and the average worker is not being protected. Okay, so there you have it. That's the whole shebang, all my points, all the possible solutions to fixing wage stagnation. I know it's a lot of information. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching the video until the end. And yeah, if you're interested in other topics just like this, please check my video out about the EU. That's the last video I made. And also just keep an eye out for more videos. If you're interested in topics like this, please subscribe to the channel. That would help us out a lot. And give this video a like and a little thumbs up. And also, I'm very open to feedback. So any feedback you could provide, that'd be much appreciated. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon.